Welcome to Latino Business Report. In this episode, we are unraveling how increased security measures and infrastructure along the U.S. Mexican border are impacting one of our North America's most vital waterways. The Rio Grande is more than just a natural boundary. It is a lifeline for countless communities, ecosystems, and species. But as the push for tighter border control intensifies, so does the unintended consequences for this precious river. My guest today is Dr. Adriana Martinez, a professor at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. She has a PhD in geography, specializing in fluvial geomorphology. Dr. Martinez studies human impacts on rivers and has been studying the Rio Grande since 2008. From disrupted wildlife habitats to altered water flow and quality, we will explore the border implications of these environmental shifts on the people who depend on the Rio Grande for their livelihoods. Join us as we navigate the complex and often overlooked environmental costs of border security and discover what steps can be taken to protect this vital river while addressing the concerns of border control. Stay tuned for a thought-provoking discussion that highlights the delicate balance between national security and environmental stewardship.
Welcome to the Latino Business Report. This podcast covers business, people, and issues of the day from a Latino perspective. The Latino Business Report is brought to you by TAMAC, the Texas Association of Mexican American Chambers of Commerce. TAMAC is the leading Hispanic business organization in Texas since 1975. Now for your host, J.R. Gonzalez.
Hello, folks, and welcome to another episode. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the Rio Grande. That is, yes, the river that separates the U.S. and Mexico. A beautiful body of water, but as of late, it's kind of a little bit under peril. And today we have with us Dr. Adriana Martinez. Dr. Martinez, how are you doing this morning?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
No, thank you for being here. Now, Dr. Martinez, I asked you on the show because you're doing some interesting work right now. You are studying the Rio Grande and some of the effects of the militarization, immigration, if you will, and all the activity that is going on. The Rio Grande is an important part of our ecosystem. It's an important part of our environment. Can you talk to us a little bit about yourself, the study, how you're doing this, and what's going on down in South Texas?
Absolutely. Yeah, the Rio Grande is an environmental asset for the border region. And I'm originally from Eagle Pass, Texas. And I originally started studying the Rio Grande, the border fence, immigration's impact on the river in about 2008. But more recently, in about 2019, I started looking at how the federal fence, how the containers along the banks affect the way that water flows in the channel. And so we've had a lot of border militarization, a lot of infrastructure that's been put in place along the banks of the river, and that's just going to fundamentally change how the river acts. And so my studies are looking at the fence, the containers, and then more recently, last July, the installation of the buoys and the impact that can have on the river.
When you say that the river is an asset, an environmental asset, but
Yeah, so it's for one would be great for recreational purposes, right? We can, Eagle Pass is a beautiful city. It's rich in culture, right? It shares the border with Piedras Negras, and Piedras Negras has a river walk along their section of the river. And if you look across from Piedras Negras to Eagle Pass, it's just concertina wire, razor wire, containers, right? Fence, now the buoys. And we could really be using that as an asset for the city to bring locals to the area, but also to bring people from outside that, right? We can have, there used to be kayak races on the river, right? It could be something that would draw people to the area. And it's just not that now that we have this Operation Lone Star and border militarization happening.
okay. I can definitely see that. I mean, kind of a tourist attraction, recreational, just the whole aesthetics of the communities. But how does the river benefit? I'm sure there's benefits to the ecological balance of the area. I mean, as far as wildlife, animals, anything, how is that being affected as well right now?
Absolutely, right. And humans too, right? It's our water source for the city, for all the cities that live along the river. But animals use that too, right? They use it for drinking water, right? There are a lot of animals that live in or near the river as well. And we've seen that they've been restricted from those zones as well. And there's been reports further down river in the valley of Texas that show that during a large fire, animals were not allowed to escape because there's fences along the river, right? Where normally they might be able to jump the river, right, or go into the river to escape that danger, they weren't able to. And so we're just now starting to do studies. There's some people out of Arizona that are actually looking at those ecological impacts for other critters that live in the area.
Okay, that's a shame. I mean, wow, hadn't thought of that. So in case of a fire or something, those wild animals just cannot escape because of those
Right.
because
And
of those
yeah,
fences and barbed wire and everything else.
yeah.
As we're looking at that, and you talked about that a little bit, the militarization of the border, and I'm one of those who believe it is actually, it is militarization. It's it's getting very very bad down there as far as the amount of people, the equipment, the things that are being done, not only to the environment, especially to the Rio Grande, but as you're doing that, part of your job is actually studying that river. And can you tell us a little bit about what the effects you've seen on the river and possibly project what's going to happen if we don't mitigate or do something a little bit differently than we're doing now?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's true that a lot of people tend to not think about the environmental impact of these types of infrastructures around the river. When I talk to locals, they're like, oh, yeah, I never thought about the environmental impact. But of course, it would have an impact. And we're seeing that directly. So along the banks at Eagle Pass, right at Shelby Park, they actually removed large swaths of vegetation. It was an invasive Carrizo cane that used to inhabit that area. And they removed that mostly because they wanted to be able to see any immigrants that are crossing through. And then along the banks above the cane, they placed in empty containers, so these empty railroad containers. And what's happening is when you remove vegetation from the banks, that destabilizes the area. There's no more roots that are holding that soil and sediment in place. And so now when water comes through there, when there's a flood, we have massive amounts of sediment moving away. And so if you actually look at the river channel from the river side, there's these really steep erosion banks that have occurred. And that could potentially be really detrimental to our water source. Anytime you're moving sediment in the river, that means you're moving pollutants in the river. And this is where people are pulling, right? Their drinking water, their agricultural water. It's a major source for that. So that's just one thing I've seen that's happened. Something similar happened when the buoys were installed. They actually removed vegetation from 4 or 5 different islands in the river, again, to try to make sure that they can see immigrants that are crossing. But that exposed those surfaces, right? We have now sediment that doesn't have vegetation holding it down. And so when we get those bigger floods, we're more likely to have that sediment moving, right? And it causes those water quality issues. And then, of course, the placement of the buoys themselves. Up to this point, we had things along the banks or up higher on the floodplain, right? The federal fence is way up high on the floodplain. The containers are along the banks. And then now the buoys are directly in the channel. And what's happening there is they're changing the way that flow is moving in the river. They put the buoys on top of this river bar, and I was just there a couple of weeks ago. And the buoys are creating an island. There's actually plants growing within the buoys, again, changing the way that flow is moving in that area, which will change that sediment that I mentioned, but it'll also change how water flows, which is actually a violation of 2 international treaties that we have with Mexico.
Yeah, affecting the flow of the water. That's a whole different podcast within itself. Let me ask you this, and I don't pretend to be smart at all. I'll just tell you that, and my listeners know that. JR is not very smart, but I'll ask the questions. So, if in fact erosion is occurring, that in a sense is almost widening the gap. And if it's widening, what are the water levels doing? Are they dropping? Are they still sustaining? Are they rising up to that level of erosion, or we just have erosion on both sides?
Well, it's hard to say because, in theory, right, if we had the same amount of rain that we typically have or we've had in the past, we would say that a wider channel means that the water levels will drop. But there's a couple of things going on. So for the most part, vegetation is only being removed on the U.S. side, right, because Mexico is not trying to expose that area, and so that means that we're losing ground on the U.S. side wherever that erosion is happening. That sediment is going somewhere, right? It's getting deposited somewhere else, so it's causing channel changes somewhere downstream. So that's happening. But another thing that we need to consider too is climate change, which is huge, right? We just had Hurricane Beryl roll through the Houston area. It's not uncommon for hurricanes to come, right, or tropical storms to come up the river valley. Sometimes they'll make their way to Eagle Pass. We are likely to get larger storms, more extreme storms, as the scientists say. And so that means that we're actually going to have more flooding likely occurring in this area. And so more flooding means more erosion, right? That means more removal of U.S. land on the U.S. side where we're experiencing erosion. But there is a balance to this, right? We're going to see erosion in one spot, we're going to see deposition in another spot. And so I'm seeing deposition within the buoys, which may eventually extend the Texas land, right? We may gain more Texas because of that in that small spot, which sounds really great,
Yeah.
right? But that's again a violation of a treaty, and this comes at a particularly important time because we have agreements with Mexico, right? Not just that we're not allowed to change the flow, but there's been reports, right, that Mexico is actually keeping more of the Rio Grande flow on their side, using it because there's more people, right, that populate the area, and so we kind of want a good relationship with Mexico so that we can maintain that status of the water, right? We can't say, hey, you're taking too much water out of the Rio Grande, and then they could throw back at us, but hey, you're moving where the flow is going, right? And so these are sort of some of the things that I think about. And in terms of erosion also, so there's deposition happening within the buoys, but there's also erosion happening on certain spots too. So if you've ever seen a picture of the buoys are, I'll describe them, they're 1,000-foot long chain of these giant orange balls, right? Imagine exaggerated yoga balls that are in the middle of the river going downriver, and they're chained or cabled to these large concrete blocks. And those blocks are essentially anchors that are meant to keep them in place. But as I was walking around the buoys, as I was walking around the anchors, I really wanted to know, right, what sort of erosion is happening around those things. Anytime you put a concrete block in the river, it's going to act like a boulder. And the water will route around it, but it'll actually undermine at the upstream end of those concrete blocks. And so what I found was that there's actually a few inches of space between the bottom of the concrete block and the bottom of the riverbed at the top of the concrete block. So right along the riverbed, but towards upstream. What does all that mean, right? That means that there's erosion happening around the concrete blocks, which are supposed to be holding these things in place, right? And we haven't had big flows. There haven't been large floods yet, right? The river water has been fairly low. Eagle Pass is under water restrictions right now, but just wait till we do get some big flows. Those concrete blocks are very likely to move. And so once they start moving, that means the buoys move, right? And then you've got a whole chain of events of things that can happen, right? If they become dislodged, if a buoy gets detached, right? Is it going to hit a bridge pier downstream, right? There's a lot of things that could happen in terms of infrastructure too, with relation to erosion.
But it seems like the wisdom of the state of Texas that it was smart to put buoys in the water. But anyway, okay. You are are you a biologist? Or what are you?
I'm a geographer.
A geographer. All right. With that, and here's a question you may or may not be able to answer. It would seem to me that, I mean, one, you're tampering with drinking water, with water source. I mean, that's tricky enough. But as far as the vegetation of the river and some of the different species and the fish life, is that being adversely affected right now from your studies?
Yeah, I would say so. And while I don't do a lot of the ecology or biology side, one of the really cool things about geography is that we do look at things from this more holistic perspective. So, I'm not just studying the sediment, but I'm studying how is the vegetation interacting with the sediment, right? How are people being affected by the fact that the buoys are in place and it's adjusting the river? And so, yeah, right. One of the things that I did when I was out there a couple of weeks ago was I took sediment samples around the buoys. And the reason I do that is because I'm interested to see like, has the flow changed in that area? What is the flow doing in that area? And what affects the sediment that's present is the flow. If you have faster flows, the sediment is a different size than places where you have lower flows. And so that's one of the things I want to look at is, right, what sort of sediment is changing, because that's habitat, right? Fish lay their eggs in that sediment. Plants grow in that sediment, and the types of sediment sizes that we get can affect the habitat essentially of those different plants, those different fish, right? Any sort of creatures that live there.
Okay. So not good for the plant and fish life.
No, it's changing things, right? Where it's changing things, and these things can already be vulnerable because of climate change, right? Other human impacts.
Right. As we're looking at this, I mean, I'm researching and looking at some video clips. Am I mistaken, or am I seeing actual vegetation growing on some of those buoys? And how in the world,
There
how is that
yeah.
happening?
So basically what's happening is, right, the buoys are slowing down water, and when you have slow water, sediment drops out because the sediment can't be carried by slow water. And so when sediment drops out, that means the water becomes shallower. With shallow water, the sun can reach into the bottom of the river channel. And so plants start growing because photosynthesis can happen. And so that's exactly what we've seen happening. So I was walking around those. I saw what I thought were willows growing in the buoys, right? That is just astonishing
in
to
the
me.
buoys, physically
In the
in
buoys,
the buoys.
yeah, physically in the buoys, to have little baby willows growing, right? If those are allowed to stay there, right? So if no big floods come through, right? Because if a big flood comes through, it'll just rip those baby willows out. But if a flood doesn't come through, they're going to just grow bigger and bigger. And it's likely a flood won't come through because, again, we're under water restrictions. We have Amistad Dam upstream in Del Rio. They're not letting out water, not to any large extent, right? So we're just not likely to see big flows that are able to rip that vegetation out as would naturally happen. So they're just going to get bigger and bigger, right? There is some question about whether the state of Texas is or has done an environmental inspection of the buoys. They were supposed to do an environmental inspection, but I've talked to several reporters that are trying to seek out that report. They've been unsuccessful to seek that out, but I'm curious, right? Has the state of Texas gone to go look at them, right? If they do see them and notice the vegetation's growing in them, are they going to remove that vegetation, right? What are they going to do in order to fix that, right? Essentially, or make it like it was before. And then, of course, I have a lot of questions about, like, would it be good to have a bulldozer in the river ripping that out, right? Probably not. My suggestion would be go in and rip out the buoys, and then the river will take care of itself.
Yeah.
Rivers are really good at bouncing back.
Rip out the buoys. Okay. I'm biting my tongue right now. I want to say so many things, but okay, we won't. And what I'm going to do, Dr. Martinez, is, and listeners, if you go to our Facebook page, which is Latino Business Report, same title, same name, Latino Business Report on Facebook, I'll actually post some videos and photos of what we're talking about. So the listeners, if they are so inclined, can go to the Facebook page and start looking at some of the photos that what you just described. As we're looking at this, as you're studying the river, if nothing changes, if those buoys stay in place for another 5, 6, 7 years, 3 years, even shorter, what's going to happen to the river? Do you have any idea, any projections of what that river is going to look like? And is the river levels, I know they have to be being affected as far as the level of the river, and it's becoming just shallower and shallower?
Yeah, so actually, I was really surprised how quickly the river responded to the buoys. So I was shocked that there's that many plants growing. I was shocked at how much sediment deposition is happening. So this is happening way faster than I thought it would. And what I suspect is going to happen is an island is going to be created right there at the buoys. Eventually, because the buoys are so close to the U.S. side. So if you're not familiar with the news, right, the buoys were originally placed closer towards the center of the channel. But then Mexico complained, right, rightfully so, hey, those are on our side of the river, you can't do that. And so Texas then moved them over a few meters to be on the U.S. side of the river. And so they are right closer to the U.S. side. So what's going to happen is an island is going to develop there, and that island will likely become connected to the main bank eventually, right? And so now an island gets stuck against the bank, right? It's just extending out more of the U.S. land. And which, again, sounds good, right? But that's going to change change the way that the water flows. And so if you're looking at the water going downstream, there's going to be an island that forms, right, and then connects to the left side on the U.S. side. And then on the right side, the river's going to turn to the right. And it could cause a large meander, right, or a large bend in the river going in that direction, which will result in erosion happening on the Mexican side. So I imagine that it's going to change the path of the river, really, such that eventually Mexico gets less land, the U.S. gets more land, right? And so, and that again could happen much sooner than we think, right? Maybe in the next year or so.
And we're talking about an island. We're not talking something like South Padre Island or anything like that. We're talking just like a bar of dirt.
Yes, really, yeah. So the difference between a bar and an island is an island has permanent vegetation, which is things like willows that have grown big, right? And so that's exactly why the willows that I saw a couple of weeks ago are an indication that, like, hey, if those stick around and they keep growing and they get bigger, we're going to have an island, not just a river bar. A river bar doesn't have vegetation, or it might have a little bit of grass on it or something like that, but not any major trees.
Okay, that kind of explains it a little bit. With this and your study of the river, and thank you so much for doing this. Thank you for being on the show and doing this type of study. And needless to say, it's affecting our wildlife. So, is there anybody else studying the river besides yourself?
So not too many that I'm aware of. I think there's more people that are sort of learning about this and making it a topic of focus. But, I grew up in Eagle Pass. I grew up going to the Rio Grande to do water quality sampling when I was in high school. My environmental science teacher took me out to Shelby Park, and we, measured things like dissolved oxygen at the river. And so it instilled in me a love for the river. And there's not that many people that tend to spend a lot of time on the river like that, particularly not from Eagle Pass. And of course, now we are likely to have even less people because nobody can get access to the river, right? It's been cut off. So there's not a ton of people that are studying it. I'm one of the very few. And I'm trying to, get people to understand, right, that the immigration problem is, of course, really important, and we need new legislation, and we need to be considerate of the people that are trying to come to the U.S. also. But, there's also this environmental aspect that a lot of people may not have thought about.
Definitely. Now, I'm from the valley myself. I was actually born in Mercedes along the river, and I remember as a kid going fishing in the Rio Grande. As far as fish, I mean, is it also a food supply for people? The river? Yeah. In particular, on the Mexican side, more people fish there. So when I was on the river a couple of weeks ago, we saw several fishermen that were catching fish, right, for food. So definitely it can be a food source. And if you talk to people from Eagle Pass, they grew up fishing on the river, right? They would take a boat out, or they'd, have a little fishing spot that they'd go stand on the bank by. And that's just not the case anymore. You don't hear about that quite a lot. You can't really get access to the river. There's concertina wire. I heard one report, I'm not sure about it, but they said Maverick County, where Eagle Pass is located, has the most concertina wire per mile of any other county that's on the river. There's just no way to touch the water if you don't have DPS permission, National Guard permission, right? Maybe if you own property, private property that they haven't built a fence on, then you're able to, get right up to the river. But for the most part, if I just want to go see the river, I have to be up high on a bluff and be standing right by the border fence, right? And I can't actually get to the river in any way. So I think that's been a major limitation is people, it's a no man's land right now because of that militarization. And we're talking about militarization, but how many troops how many people do you actually see down there? I know that public park is no longer a public park; it's like a military installation. But are we talking dozens, hundreds, thousands? How many people are we talking about?
I would say within Shelby Park, when I've been there, during the day, during a weekday, there were probably 2 or 3 dozen National Guard and DPS soldiers just in that one spot, right? You can't see them all. Some of them are working in tents, but it's a huge presence. And then, of course, right, aside from the people that are there manning the border, you also have that infrastructure. There's some sections of the river where I've counted 5 different fence layers. You have the federal or the state, what you call aesthetic fencing, right? It's that typical black fencing that we think about
Right.
that's really tall. But then you also have multiple layers of chain link fencing that has concertina wire or razor wire on top of that. And then you have these fences of rolls of concertina wire. If you go to the buoys, there's the state fence, there's 2 layers of chain link fence, and then at least 2, if not 3 layers of concertina wire fencing. So, how much money is that? I have a lot of questions about how much we're spending on that. What's going to be done to clean up those areas, right? What happens when the concertina wire gets, a ton of branches in it when it floods, or clothes from the immigrants? How do you dispose of that, right? That's an environmental concern in and of itself.
And with that kind of law enforcement or military presence, and with all those layers of buoys and concertina wire and all that, you'd think that somebody go, well, we're not going to cross here. Let's just go upstream a few miles. I mean, it just baffles me sometimes. I've come to the conclusion that common sense is not that common. And that area may be secure, but look at the damage it's doing. Look at the money that's being spent, and is it really affecting the amount of people coming over and crossing? So.
Right, and when you put those layers in, right, you're like, what's the thought process, right? 4 fences aren't working, guys. Let's put in a 5th one.
Yeah.
Like, or let's throw in another, let's put in some buoys in the water, right? And when I sampled there last November, we saw probably 24 immigrants cross just upstream of the buoys, and that's just because it was shallower in that one spot. So yes, you have 1,000 feet of buoys, but people will find a way across. Animals will find a way across.
Yeah.
When I was there a couple of weeks ago, I saw horses from Mexico crossing over the river, and they were just crossing downstream of the buoys, right? So that it's not really doing what it's supposed to be.
And those horses and people, they're just kind of walking across, wading across. I mean,
right, absolutely.
Maybe knee deep water.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So 1,000 foot of buoys and concertina wire, so just go 1,005 feet over and cross.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Insanity. All right. So, Dr. Martinez, thank you so much for being. This has been very enlightening, and I want to stay in touch. And please, if you have any good photographs, if you have any good video clips, send them to me, and I'll go ahead and post them on our Facebook page, Latino Business Report, and that way our listeners can actually visit that and see some of those things firsthand for themselves. And just so you know, I plan on going down to the valley, especially to Eagle Pass, and see what you're talking about firsthand. I got a group of people in our Leadership Texas class, and then we want to, as part of our curriculum, is to see firsthand some of the things that are happening down there. And I'm looking forward to seeing it. And when we're there, I'll bring you back a water sample or whatever you need.
Awesome. Thank you. People are always welcome to visit Eagle Pass.
It's great community. In fact, Eagle Pass, and we talked about it pre-show, I believe on the other side of Eagle Pass, we have Piedras Negras, and that's where the nacho was actually invented. Yep. That, my friends, if you don't know that story, that's a whole nother podcast, but look it up. The actual nacho was invented in Piedras Negras, which is just the other side of Eagle Pass, Texas. Once again, Dr. Martinez, any closing comments? Anything before we go?
No, one other question that I have is environmental permits, right? What sort of things were done before this happened, right? And that could be also a whole other podcast. Is there's this construction, right, through Operation Lone Star, and there's a lot of questions about where did they, get that permission to do those things.
Good point. And I also like your point you made earlier. Is Texas done any type of environmental impact study on the river or surrounding areas, and what all this is actually going to mean long term?
Yeah. Lots of questions.
Good questions. All right, folks. Thank you very much. My name is J.R. Gonzalez. You've been listening to the Latino Business Report. We've been here with Dr. Adriana Martinez, who is studying the Rio Grande. And thank you so much for doing that. It's we need to get more people to find out about what's going on at the river, and at least bring this to the attention of some of our lawmakers and elected officials, and go, hey, the river is a precious resource. It's a treasure. It should be treated well. And immigration is one thing, but the issue of our environment is also very, very important to a lot of people. So, guys, till next time, you can find us wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. We also have a YouTube channel. It's audio only. but we have our entire library of episodes there, and you can also find us at latinobusinessreport.com. Visit our website page, look at some background, some more stories, and more in-depth things about what's going on and what we're talking about. Okay, folks, that pretty much wraps up the show. Dr. Martinez, thank you so much for joining us, and God bless you for the work that you're doing. Keep us informed. Let's stay in touch. We want to find out what's going on. If there's any major changes, give me a call. We'll do another episode on this. Guys, till then, stay safe, stay cool, and enjoy the rest of the summer.